$136 million. This amount could sustain the basic living needs of millions of people for at least 50 years. But here, it is used to build something else, an idea of the future, transformed into steel, light, and space. In the heart of Dubai, a structure emerges unlike anything around it. A massive glowing ellipse in the night, hollow at its center like an unanswered question. It is not just architecture. It seems to carry a larger ambition, to package the very concept of the future and place it into a space where people can walk in, observe, and believe they are touching tomorrow. But what happens when the future no longer feels surprising? When an idea built to be ahead of its time faces a world that is changing faster than itself? Stay with us to explore more. The rise of the Museum of the Future did not begin as a conventional cultural project, but rather as a carefully positioned extension of a broader national vision that first took shape around 2015 during discussions at the World Government Summit. At that moment, the idea was not simply to construct another landmark in a city already known for architectural ambition. Instead, it was framed as something far more deliberate, a platform through which a nation could signal how it sees the future, and more importantly, how it intends to shape it. From the outset, the concept deliberately distanced itself from the traditional definition of a museum. There would be no primary focus on preservation, no central mission of archiving the past. Instead, the Museum of the Future was described as a living laboratory, a space where emerging technologies, speculative ideas, and long-term global challenges could be explored in real time. This positioning aligned closely with narratives frequently emphasized in international policy forums, particularly the notion that the future is not something to be awaited, but something that can be actively designed through strategic investment, governance, and innovation. What made this vision particularly notable was how seamlessly it integrated into a larger economic and political framework. During the mid-2010s, as global conversations increasingly turned toward automation, artificial intelligence, and post-oil economic transitions, the UAE appeared to be accelerating its efforts to reposition itself as a hub for knowledge, technology, and forward-looking policy. Initiatives such as national innovation strategies, artificial intelligence, roadmaps, and long-term development plans all seem to reinforce a consistent message that adaptability and foresight would define the next phase of global relevance. Within that context, the Museum of the Future functioned less as an isolated project and more as a symbolic anchor. Its role was not only to attract visitors, but to communicate credibility. The building itself, with its distinctive torus shape and calligraphic facade, was designed to embody a narrative of continuity and ambition, merging cultural identity with technological aspiration. International media coverage from outlets such as BBC, CNN, and the New York Times often highlighted this duality, noting how the structure served both as an architectural achievement and as a statement of intent. At the same time, there was an underlying assumption built into the project that deserves closer attention. The belief that the future can be curated, structured, and presented within a controlled environment reflects a broader trend seen in several large-scale, state-backed innovation hubs around the world. These projects often operate on the premise that by concentrating talent, capital, and ideas into a single, highly visible space, it becomes possible to accelerate progress and shape global narratives. However, even in its early stages, some analysts and observers suggested that this approach carried certain limitations. Reports from publications like the Financial Times and The Economist occasionally pointed out that while such projects are highly effective as symbols, their long-term impact tends to depend on deeper systemic factors, education ecosystems, private sector innovation, regulatory flexibility, and sustained global engagement. In other words, a building, no matter how advanced, cannot by itself guarantee the kind of future it seeks to represent. Still, between 2015 and its opening in 2022, the Museum of the Future appeared to successfully capture global attention. It became a focal point for discussions about what cities of the future might look like, how governments could anticipate technological disruption, and how nations might compete not only through economic output, but through vision itself. In that sense, its rise was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate alignment between architecture, policy, and narrative, each reinforcing the idea that the future was not just approaching, but already being constructed. Yet embedded within that success was a quiet tension. The more the project came to symbolize a bold, curated vision of tomorrow, the more it raised an implicit question. To what extent can the future truly be designed from the top down, and where do the limits of that ambition begin to emerge? Looking back at the 22nd of February 2022, many people may remember it as more than just an ordinary if-to-tash day. The lights, the stage technology displays, the symbolic appearances all combined to create a feeling closer to a product launch than a cultural institution. And in a world that had just come out of a turbulent period, when the desire to travel was beginning to return, the timing may have felt more perfect than ever. People didn't just want to go somewhere, they wanted to go somewhere that could tell them a new story. And the Museum of the Future seemed to do that quite effectively. In a short time, images of the structure appeared almost everywhere. From Instagram and TikTok to YouTube, short videos and wide-angle photos with light glowing through its metallic calligraphy surface seemed almost designed to spread without much explanation. It felt as if the building was not just created to be visited, but also optimized to become content. What stands out is that this spread did not seem to stop at visuals alone. It began to influence how people viewed Dubai. For many years, the city was often associated with very specific things: shopping, luxury hotels, record-breaking structures. But the emergence of the Museum of the Future appeared to add another layer of meaning, an effort to shift toward an image of knowledge, technology, and longer-term questions about the future. This may not be a replacement, but rather a well-crafted addition. People could still come to Dubai to relax and enjoy themselves, but now they could also say they came to experience the future. And in a world where everyone is trying to understand what comes next, that phrase seemed to carry a unique appeal. The early numbers seemed to support this narrative. More than 5 million visitors within the first few years, with a large portion being international tourists, suggested that the appeal extended far beyond the region. But looking closer, perhaps the story is not just about volume. Revenue did not come only from ticket sales, but also from events, conferences, and technology partnerships, elements that created the sense that this was not just a destination, but an experience ecosystem. Still, perhaps the most interesting question lies in why all of this happened at that specific moment. After a period when the world seemed to slow down, people began seeking more meaningful experiences. Not just entertainment, but the feeling of touching something larger, a vision, a possibility, or simply a story that made them feel like they were moving forward. In some way, the Museum of the Future appeared to tap into that mindset very effectively. It did not just show technology, but offered a feeling of the future, even if that feeling may have been carefully curated. And for many, perhaps that was enough. But this is also where a question begins to emerge, subtle at first, yet increasingly difficult to ignore. When global attention reaches its peak, what happens next? When novelty starts to fade, can the experience still hold the same level of appeal? After the impressive early months, when images of the structure seemed to be everywhere, interest appeared to enter a more stable phase. The waves of rapid sharing were no longer as intense. The feeling of, if you haven't been, you're missing out, seemed to fade. Instead, the Museum of the Future began to feel more like a regular stop among many options in Dubai. Thinking about it more carefully, this may not be surprising. Many international analyses from long-established publications often suggest that most iconic structures follow a similar cycle. A highly anticipated launch, a surge in media attention, a peak of global focus, and then gradual stabilization. Not because they lose value, but perhaps because the public becomes familiar with them. In the early stage, people came out of curiosity. Because of the name, because of the visuals, and sometimes, if being honest, perhaps also because of a very modern pressure. When everyone around you is talking about a place, you want to see it for yourself. But after 1 or 2 years, that motivation seems to shift. Returning is no longer driven by curiosity, but by a much simpler question: is the experience worth repeating? And this is where things become more challenging. Some regional tourism data seems to suggest an interesting trend. High-tech destinations often do not maintain high return visitor rates compared to traditional leisure or entertainment spots. Perhaps because the first-time feeling, once very powerful, is not easy to recreate. Once you have seen the future being presented, the next time, you begin to look at it differently, more realistically, and perhaps more critically. At the same time, the sense of urgency to experience it also appears to decline. Initially, the Museum of the Future may have been seen as a must-visit destination. But over time, it becomes more of an option, if you have time. The difference between these two states may seem small, but in the tourism industry, it can mean everything. And then there is another factor you may already be wondering about: the story it's trying to deliver. A museum about history can maintain its value for decades. But what about a museum about the future? It may sound paradoxical, but the more it speaks about the future, the more easily it can be caught up by the present. What was once considered cutting edge just a few years ago can quickly feel familiar, even outdated, as real-world technology continues to advance. This creates significant pressure. To maintain its appeal, the Museum of the Future seems to need constant reinvention not only in form, but in content, ideas, and storytelling. And as many might expect, that is neither inexpensive nor easy. Here, a paradox becomes clearer. The exterior, almost visually perfect, continues to attract attention. It remains something people stop for, photograph, and share. But the interior, where the real experience takes place, must continuously evolve to keep up with rising expectations. And in a broader context, the Museum of the Future does not seem to be alone. Many technology-driven destinations around the world are facing a similar reality. As experiences like virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and digital interaction become more common, they no longer deliver the same wow effect as before. People begin to look for something deeper, not just something to see, but something to understand, to connect with, to remember. Perhaps this is where value begins to shift. From visual impact to experiential depth, from initial impression to lasting meaning. So this plateau phase may not necessarily be negative. It feels more like a test, a measure of whether a structure built to represent the future can continue to reinvent itself fast enough to avoid being overtaken by that very future. There was a time not too long ago when a place like the Museum of the Future seemed almost untouchable. A symbol, a statement, maybe even a promise. But by 2026, something feels different. Not dramatically so. Not in a way that makes headlines overnight, but in a slower, quieter sense, the kind of shift that people don't always talk about, yet somehow feel. If you've been watching global travel patterns closely, you might have noticed that international demand toward parts of the Middle East appears to have softened in certain periods. Some estimates suggest declines ranging anywhere from roughly 11% to 27%, depending on where visitors are coming from. And it doesn't seem to point to one single cause. It's more like a combination of pressures quietly stacking up. Airfare hasn't exactly become easier to justify, especially for long-haul travelers. Economic uncertainty lingers in the background. And for many older American travelers, particularly those who've worked decades to earn the freedom to travel, there seems to be a growing tendency to pause and ask a simple question. Is this trip really worth it right now? You see, once that hesitation sets in, destinations that once felt like must-see now experiences can start to feel more like maybe later. And maybe later, as many have learned over the years, has a way of quietly turning into maybe never. What makes this shift more interesting is how it plays out in the business travel world, the MICE segment that cities like Dubai have long relied on. Conferences, corporate gatherings, international exhibitions, these weren't just side attractions. They were dependable pipelines of visitors. But lately, it seems companies are becoming more cautious. Not necessarily pulling back completely, but trimming, adjusting, optimizing. Large in-person events may be fewer. Hybrid formats, part in-person, part virtual, seem to be gaining ground. And even when people do travel, they may stay fewer days, spend more selectively, and move on faster. For a destination like the Museum of the Future, this could matter more than it first appears. Group visitors, conference attendees, corporate delegations often bring a kind of steady volume. Lose a portion of that, and the ripple effects may not be dramatic overnight, but they can accumulate. And then there's the traveler mindset itself. Because something else appears to be changing. And perhaps this is where it gets a bit more personal. Travel, for many, doesn't seem to be about checking boxes anymore. Especially for older travelers who've seen enough to know the difference between something impressive and something meaningful. There's a growing pull toward experiences that feel quieter, more personal, less crowded. Places where you don't feel like one of thousands moving through the same path. Places that don't just look good in photos, but feel worth remembering a year later. And that creates a subtle challenge. Because landmarks like the Museum of the Future were, in many ways, designed to impress at scale, to inspire awe, to deliver something visually and conceptually powerful to large numbers of people at once. But when expectations shift toward personalization, toward depth, instead of spectacle, that same strength can start to feel less aligned. At the same time, Dubai itself hasn't slowed down. If anything, it seems to be accelerating, adding new attractions, new districts, new experiences at a pace that almost feels relentless. And that creates another layer of pressure. Because when everything is new, nothing stays new for long. Attention gets divided, time gets fragmented. A visitor who might have spent a full day at one landmark a few years ago may now split that time across 3 or 4 places. Not because any one destination has declined, but because there are simply more options competing for the same attention. Energy prices shift. Interest rates stay elevated. Financial decisions, even for travel, start to feel heavier. Trips get planned later. Durations shrink. People lean toward choices that feel safe, familiar, and clearly worth the investment. When uncertainty rises, experimentation tends to fall. You don't stop traveling, you just become more selective. And that selectiveness changes everything, because it raises the bar not just for being impressive, but for being worth it. All of this leads to a conclusion that may feel a bit counterintuitive. At its core, the Museum of the Future does not seem to operate like a traditional museum. It does not preserve what has already happened, but instead attempts to present what might happen ahead: artificial intelligence, space, biotechnology, or climate scenarios. A few years ago, these topics may have still felt distant enough to impress most visitors. However, the issue is that the future, at least in the current stage, does not seem to move at a pace that an exhibition space can easily keep up with. It moves faster, and perhaps much faster than the way such structures were originally designed to operate. Analyses often suggest that organizations tied to technological innovation are now facing increasingly shorter update cycles. It is no longer a matter of years, not even necessarily a full year, but sometimes just a few months before what is considered new begins to feel familiar. In that context, when the identity of a structure is closely tied to being ahead of its time, even slowing down just by a beat can make it seem as if it is falling behind. This creates a quiet but constant pressure. Visitors do not see the operational challenges behind the scenes. They arrive with a clear expectation. There must be something new. There must be a reason for the trip to feel worthwhile. And more importantly, it must be something they have not experienced elsewhere. And this is where a paradox begins to emerge. The outside world does not stand still. Technology continues to advance. Personal devices become more powerful, and experiences that once required special venues now seem to exist in everyday life. As a result, when the future presented inside begins to resemble what people are already familiar with outside, the sense of surprise may diminish. Not necessarily outdated, but perhaps less impressive. And for an audience that has lived through multiple waves of change, especially older visitors who have witnessed technological transitions over time, that element of surprise becomes even more important. When someone has already been impressed many times in life, recreating that same feeling once again does not seem easy. This may explain why the wow effect does not last as long as before. You may notice a familiar pattern. The first visit is discovery, the second is comparison, and by the third, people begin to question whether the experience is truly worth returning for. For the Museum of the Future, this could become a long-term challenge. Attracting first-time visitors may still be effective, but retaining them and encouraging repeat visits appears far more difficult, especially as expectations rise with each return. Even a positive signal like sold-out status may carry two sides. From a branding perspective, it creates a sense of scarcity and enhances perceived value. But from another angle, it may become a barrier, especially for travelers who prefer not to plan too rigidly or depend on fixed schedules. For many people, particularly those who no longer feel the need to chase experiences, convenience and flexibility may matter just as much as the destination itself. When access becomes complicated, alternatives always seem available. Behind all of this lies a rarely discussed challenge: maintenance costs. Not just the initial construction cost, but the ongoing expense of continuously updating, upgrading, and refreshing content. Technology needs replacement, experiences must be redesigned, and highly skilled personnel are required to operate it all. Industry analyses often indicate that high-tech experience models carry significantly higher maintenance costs than traditional museums. This creates a delicate balance. Revenue depends on visitor volume, while visitor expectations continue to rise, and the cost of meeting those expectations does not appear to decrease over time. Looking more broadly, this story may not be entirely new. Many iconic structures around the world seem to follow a similar cycle: an initial surge of attention, followed by stabilization, and eventually a phase of competing to remain relevant. Experts have often referenced this pattern, and if applied here, the Museum of the Future may be gradually entering the stage where maintaining its position becomes more difficult than achieving it. Because, ultimately, the greatest challenge may not lie in architecture or technology, but in the ability to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. As attention becomes more fragmented, as new ideas constantly emerge, and as travelers grow more selective with their time and money, Maintaining a position as worth experiencing may become the most difficult problem of all. Looking back more honestly at this entire journey, the Museum of the Future may not just be a structure, it seems to be a bold statement about how humans believe they can capture the future itself. And for a moment, that statement truly made the world pause, look, and talk about it. But then, that same world continued moving. Faster, more complex, and perhaps less willing to wait. What makes this story thought-provoking is not whether the structure still attracts attention, but the sense that it is placed in a race with no clear finish line. A place built to stay ahead of its time may now be trying to keep from being overtaken by that very time. It sounds paradoxical, but perhaps that is the real limit of billion-dollar dreams, not in their ambition, but in their ability to keep that ambition feeling new in a world that never stands still. And perhaps this is the quieter tragedy that few talk about. Not disappearance, not an obvious failure, but the feeling that everything is still there, just no longer creating the same level of impact as before. A symbol still stands, but its meaning seems to be slowly shifting. So the question may no longer be how big the Museum of the Future once was, but how long it can hold that position. What about you? Have you ever visited this place? And if you have, would you return a second time? Share your thoughts below. This video is built based on data aggregation, public reports, and perspectives from the user community. The content is analytical, and for reference purposes, not intended to criticize or represent any organization, individual, or country. All opinions can change over time and context. The truth is always deeper than what we see. And this might just be the beginning.